You start here, Tony. Great. Everyone good to go? Great. Thanks all for being here. So today the seasonal outlook for summer 2024 was released by the National Council for Fire and Emergency Services. That's AFAC, and that's made up of fire and emergency service chiefs from around the country. So our government has been working with all levels of government, state, local, industry and communities to prepare for the coming season. So in the lead up to this season, the National Emergency Management Agency has conducted the largest ever preparedness program across the nation. We have directly engaged over 2,500 people through information sessions and also through crisis scenario planning to get us ready for the season ahead. Now, preparing and responding to disasters remains primarily a state and territory responsibility, but our government is investing in a range of capabilities that will provide more support to states and territories to respond to disasters. We've increased our investment in the National Aerial Fleet to approximately $48 million per year, and so for the first time, states and territories will have access to 3 federally funded heavy lift and multi-use helicopters in addition to the large air tanker. We have invested in the national stockpile. It includes resources that states and territories can use when they need, things like emergency housing, large generators, water filtration equipment, water pumps and flood barriers. We're also investing in risk reduction through our Disaster Ready Fund to help communities better prepare for disasters, and Senator Sheldon will speak to you a little bit about that in a moment. Now, the outlook that is released today draws on the collective expertise and the on-ground knowledge of our fire and emergency services right across Australia, as well as data from the Bureau of Meteorology, and it identifies an increased risk of fire in large parts of the country. It's really important to say this. It is not intended as a prediction, but it identifies areas of increased risk so that communities can prepare. And you'll see from the maps here that it differs a little bit from the outlook that was released by AFAC for spring. And those changes, those differences, are consistent with what we would ordinarily see, which is that as the rains come into the northern part of the country, the risk tends to move southward. There is an increased risk of fire in the south, on Western Australia's southeastern coastline and central west, and that extends to parts of South Australia's lower coastal southeast region and the lower Eyre Peninsula. Further east, large areas of the southwest and far west of Victoria, parts of the northeast and the Mornington Peninsula in southwest Gippsland have an increased risk of fire, as do central, northern and central southern New South Wales. And to the north, fire risk is increased in long unburnt areas in the southern half of the NT, and that stretches north up to the north of the Barkly Highway and to the Queensland border. Now, Australians know, of course, that bushfire isn't the only thing that we've got to think about in the summertime. On the east coast, communities are preparing for a summer of severe storms and east coast lows. Up north, we can expect a higher than average chance of severe cyclones, and we should all be prepared for the risk of heat waves, the largest killer of all of the natural hazards. And so my message to the community is that we can't eliminate these risks, but we can prepare for them. Our government is focused on working with the states and the territories ahead of this season to do this. And there are many things that people in the community can do to prepare as well. And so the key messages to the community are this: understand the risk in your local area. Have a plan and a kit, the things you'll take with you if you need to leave. And if you are a person with special needs or you care for a person with special needs, you need to think about those requirements when you're making your plan as well. And finally, please listen to authorities, heed their advice. I will now pass to Senator Sheldon, and then we'll have a chance to hear from Joe Buffone, the Deputy Coordinator General from NEMA, and Dr. Karl Braganza from the B.O.M. Tony.
Good, thanks very much, Jenny. And of course, as we know, we're a country of natural hazards, and part of the preparedness for natural hazards before they become humanitarian challenges, whether it be for the local community or individuals, is to have the funds, the resources and the engagement. And the Disaster Ready Fund is a $1 billion program to allocate $200 million a year to make sure that preparedness for resilience community engagement, and the opportunity to make sure that we build infrastructure, community capacity, and doing it largely with local communities through our state and territories. Now, this is a collaborative approach. That money, that $1 billion, $200 million a year, is supported by state and territory governments, and in this year we're going to be seeing well over $360 million, which will be spent on projects in the coming year in the round 2 of the Disaster Ready Fund. And we've seen projects like, which I've visited at Kununurra in the Kimberleys, new emergency and community centres there to be prepared for the coming seasons, right through to the ACT, talking to workshops with linguistic, diverse communities to make sure that your whole Australian community is aware and prepared for the coming season, and also projects right across the country. And we've seen the Disaster Ready Fund both as part of the armoury of preparedness, of resilience, of community consultation and community capacity building. So we build the national program with our states and territories. We have local and local government organisations and charities, which account for about half the projects, and those projects cascade upwards within the frame that makes the country one more step closer to being more and more prepared for the coming season. We've seen projects such as preparedness for flood mitigation, flood warnings systems to roll the way down to Albury, where we've put money into infrastructure projects such as the Albury preparedness there for or potential floods in Albury and the building up the system in that particular city. And those sorts of arrangements means that we have a system that is community-based, state and territory and cooperatively arranged, but is a critical part of the armoury of making sure that we're prepared for the coming season. And also it gives us that time to make sure that we're protecting as a community ourselves, our neighbours, within that frame that gives us an opportunity to be best prepared for this coming season that we're facing. The unwavering commitment from the government is to make sure that this Disaster Ready Fund is an ongoing program to build that community capacity. As part of that capacity building is also, of course, making the community fully aware of what the coming events are going to be. And with that, I'll hand you over to Joe to give some more detail.
Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Minister. I think the catch cry is aware and prepared. You've heard about, from the Minister and from the Senator, having that awareness and being prepared. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to what we're actually doing about some of these risks that you're going to hear from the Bureau. You're going to hear about cyclones, you're going to hear about flooding, you're going to hear about severe weather, you're going to hear about heat wave, and in particular, you're going to hear about the fire risk that's just been released by Australasian Fire Authorities Council. So right now, nationally, we are better prepared than we have ever been. We are connected, we are coordinated, we are working very closely with states and territories who have primary responsibility, but we're also working very closely with the private sector, not-for-profits, to make sure, again, that they are aware of the risks and the challenges that we face as a nation and how we can actually work together. We've got great arrangements around sharing resources across jurisdictions, but also how we engage with the private sector so that they can contribute to any impacts, in particular like supply chains. Some of the fire risk areas will have an impact on main supply routes, in particular Western Australia. You heard from the Minister the investment in aerial firefighting. The primary role is aerial firefighting. However, we're looking at multi-use so that it can support responses to cyclones, to floods, to severe weather. And in actual fact, right today, the national large air tanker has been redispatched into Western Australia to support the fire effort over there. You've heard from the Australasian Fire Authorities Council around the fire risk, and we are working directly with the Commissioners and Chief Officers to make sure that they are prepared. They are running extensive programs at the jurisdictional level and at the local level to make sure that they are in place. Now, not to be alarmist, but the key thing is that what we want to do is to make sure that communities are prepared and reinforcing the messages that the Minister just said. In particular, number one, have a plan, have your own plan. doesn't have to be over-sophisticated. Just know what you're going to do when you get the warnings. The second thing is know the environment and the risks that you're in particular if you are moving outside of your normal area. If you are going on holidays into sort of like the Grampians in Victoria or any areas in Australia, know whether you're in cyclone risk area, know whether you're in a flood area, know whether you're in a fire area. The other point is listen to local emergency services. They are the ones that know local conditions, what's going to occur, and if I can just reinforce that, they will send messages, they will send warnings. Please do not ignore them. They are sending them for you to make decisions on your safety. And the other key point is around people with special needs or carers of people with special needs, just reinforcing there is additional planning that needs to occur for you to be safe. And you may have to leave earlier or make other arrangements earlier if depending on what the circumstances are. So for again, just reinforcing, please listen to those emergency warnings and that messaging, and just reinforcing that we're preparing for the worst so that we can respond at our best. Thanks, Minister. And I'll now introduce Dr. Karl Braganza.
Thanks, Joe. So Australia has entered its high-risk weather season, and we will expect over the next 4 months to see tropical cyclones, bushfires, severe weather, floods in some part of the country. Looking at the Bureau's long-range outlook, we're looking at increased odds of a wet December, particularly across most of the east and into the northwest of WA. We're also seeing evidence that we will see a warmer than average summer with a risk of extreme heat, particularly across the north. With warm oceans around Australia, it's likely to be quite sticky and humid at times, and that is quite a big significant factor if you are vulnerable in some way, so that's the elderly or those with medical conditions who are sensitive to extreme heat. So that wet December will raise the risk of flooding this summer, particularly in the east, and it will also raise the possibility that the tropical cyclones that we will see will be more severe than those that we've seen in the past. Typically, Australia sees about 4 tropical cyclones make landfall over the high-risk weather season, and we're expecting a typical season in that regard. We should also just mention that fire is still an attendant risk in Australia. We are entering the summer period with some regions with low rainfall and soil moisture. We have seen some rain in recent days and are looking for a wet December. However, that does not mean that major fires will not follow in January and February, particularly if things dry out, and we have seen that in the past. So just to re-emphasise, Australia experienced these hazards over summer, and it is up to communities to really think about these events and prepare for them, particularly if you're in the relevant zone. Please check in with the Bureau's weather forecast, its warnings, and its long-range forecast as well, which is updated every week, because as we can see, conditions can change rather quickly depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thanks, Karl. And I should say that, we talk about above average risk or normal risk. No one should be complacent about a normal level of risk. In the Australian context, even a normal level of risk can still bring fire, it can still bring flood, it can still bring cyclone, it can still bring heat wave. We need to start thinking about the kinds of risks we're likely to be exposed to and preparing for them. Happy to take questions, and the gentlemen are happy to take questions also.
Maybe a question for Joe as well as you, Minister. Victoria looks like about half of the state is red on this map. I know kind of the way you've done this forecast, it's either above average or normal risk. There's not really a spectrum there. What can you say about the potential severity of the fires? Are we looking at something as bad as Black Summer, or is it not necessarily going to be that bad?
Look, the advice that we have at the moment, what you see on the map looks at fuel loads, population density, the ability for the resources that are available in those areas. So there's a range of factors that actually impact on it. The areas that are highlighted in Victoria in particular are relatively high risk. At this stage, it is unlikely, and I have to be cautious of this, right? Because as you've heard from the Bureau, depending on, if we get more rain, well, then the risk eases. But if we get continual heat over, 2 or 3 weeks in January and February, well, then there is a risk of significant fires. But if you think about Black Summer, there was 3,000 kilometres of fire front on the east coast. I think it's unlikely that we're going to experience something of that sort of significance, but locally and in those areas, there is a risk of increased fire, as is highlighted there. The other thing, though, in those areas, high shift in population for holiday makers. And that's a thing that we just want to, again, call out, as I said. Please, if you're moving into those areas, be aware of the risk. And enjoy the environment, but be aware.
Is it fair to characterise the risk, just looking at the maps, as elevated grass fire risk in chief, or is it substantial forest fire risk anywhere as well?
There's actually a mix in there. In the main, it's generally the lighter fuels area, so grass and scrub fire in the main. However, in some areas, there is still the risk of forest-type fires.
Oh, where would that be? That'd be important to highlight.
Well, pretty much as you see in the Victorian areas, in the main, is probably those areas there.
And I think in answer to both questions, I'd make this observation that the preparedness work that has been done between the Commonwealth and the states and territories looks very different to what it looked like 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
2,500 people engaged, one-on-one engagement with each of the jurisdictions by the National Emergency Management Agency, regular meetings between ministers discussing our preparedness. We met quite recently to talk about the season ahead. And a national situation room that is capable of coordinating a national response should things move beyond the capacity of an individual state or territory to manage it.
Minister, just to pick you up on that, a lot of the red in the Northern Territory seems to be around quite remote Indigenous communities. What work have you done with those communities in particular to really highlight the risk that they face this summer?
I'll allow the Deputy Coordinator General to speak to that a little, but the Northern Territory takes responsibility for the primary interaction with communities about both preparedness and response. Our role is to make sure that we are in a position to coordinate a national response if the circumstances get beyond the control of any individual state and territory or beyond the resources and capacities of that state and territory. That's the purpose of much of the work that NEMA has been doing, making sure that everybody is on the same page, everyone has access to the same information, and that we are well practiced in working with one another. We're exercising and understanding what capabilities each of us will bring to the table in the event that a very serious incident occurs.
Sorry. Yeah.
Did you want?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a really good point in what you're right. So there's actually fires in that area as we speak, and we've actually worked directly with the Northern Territory government, as we've highlighted, states and territories have that responsibility. We've actually put a planning team up to work with them to highlight those areas. We've also done some other work around evacuation of remote Indigenous communities, so that if that's required, and that's a lot of learnings from last season, even though that was flood focused, but again, a lot of our remote Indigenous communities were overrepresented. But reinforcing the point that every state and territory is doing very specific work to the risks that they're facing. The Victorian issue, they are doing a lot of work locally to make sure that they are prepared.
Minister, given the risk of heat waves, is the government considering providing extra bill support for people in those heat wave areas so that they can actually keep the aircon on and stay safe over summer?
I think you've seen this government bring intense focus to supporting families with cost of living, whether it's through the tax cuts, whether it's through supporting wage increases, or indeed bill relief for both households and businesses to deal with costs associated with electricity. We'll always continue to look at what we can do to support communities, but right now around the country, families are receiving bills that are cheaper as a consequence of the bill relief that's been provided.
Specific for the summer period?
We're working with communities to get good information about what they can do to stay cool. Sometimes that's about modifications to an individual home. Sometimes it's about finding a place that you can go to stay cool. But you're quite right, it is a risk, and it's a matter that state and territories and the Commonwealth need to keep thinking about, as we are likely to experience more and more hot days as the climate changes.
On that topic, how worried are you about heat waves, the conditions we've seen in Sydney the last couple of days? Is that a sign of more to come over summer?
Look, I can ask Dr Braganza to speak to the expectations, but I mean broadly, yes, we are expecting above average temperatures in large parts of the country.
Yeah, the long-range forecast shows that we are expecting high odds of warmer than average conditions over summer. Typically that raises the risk of heat waves and impactful heat waves as well. Probably one of the notable things in the forecast is the elevated overnight temperatures. That can have quite a large impact on health because you don't tend to cool off overnight, and that's particularly the case across the north. And I also called out just how warm the oceans are around Australia, which can increase the humidity, and we're sort of seeing that already in the last few days and weeks actually. We're seeing some quite significant rainfall events, but even down in Melbourne it's been significantly hotter than it would normally be with those sorts of rainfall events. Yeah.
Minister, it's a question related to climate change specifically. Forgive me if I'm incorrect, but we appear to be in a season that's neither an El Niño nor a La Niña on the east coast, and yet we still have quite significant risks of both flood and fire. Is this the new normal that people need to be prepared for as the climate continues to warm over the next at least 10 to 15 years, possibly longer? And does that present a different challenge when you don't have a predominant climatic driver in having to prepare for all manner of issues?
I'd make this broad remark about the way we respond to this information. We are preparing for all contingencies, and so the work that we've been doing with the states and territories isn't focused on a particular hazard or risk. It's actually focused on being prepared for all of them, because as you've correctly observed, we can expect over the season to experience, all of the above. We could have fires and cyclones and storms. And the big challenge that the Australian government needs to be prepared for is the coordinating role that we need to play when those things are happening concurrently, because it's on those occasions that our organisations at a state level find it hardest to respond. But I'll ask Dr. Braganza to provide some observations about the more technical aspects of your questions about how the weather works.
Yeah, so we've had a La Niña event trying to get going this year. It hasn't quite got there. If it does get there in the next month or so, it'll be a very weak and short-lived event. Nevertheless, we've got high odds of a wetter than average December. More typical summer rainfall in the next 2 months in January and February. But that situation with El Niño and La Niña, particularly over the last couple of years, has really emphasised that yes, the climate is changing. We're less likely now to forecast the summer or even infer the summer based on our kind of analogues of history, what we past experienced during an El Niño or La Niña event, and we're very much going with the Bureau's dynamical model, which is an extension of the weather model run in long-range mode. And so that's the primary guidance. It's showing that you have these elevated odds for above average rainfall and elevated odds for extreme heat. There are trends going on in the background as well, and that's adding some predictability to the system. So an earlier fire season, you can almost guarantee, well not guarantee, but you can almost bet on having an earlier start to the fire season compared to last century. And we're seeing that year after year that fires kick off in late winter and spring. You're seeing when tropical cyclones do form, that they can be more intense by wind speed, but significant amounts of flooding following it. And that is, again, a trend associated with climate change. As the atmosphere warms and as the ocean warms, when you get the right conditions for rainfall, it tends to be heavier in the past. So those are those attendant risks now that we all need to just be mindful of.
Senator,
I'll just go to a couple up the back and then come back to you, Mike.
can we go to other topics, or do you still want to get questions on?
We'll finish off on the weather.
Just one more question about the heat waves. Has there been coordination with state and territory primary health or hospitals about increased presentations, people suffering heat stroke, that sort of thing?
Joe, I might ask you to respond to that.
We've actually, in line with not only the outlook, but as part of the summit, we've connected with the Department of Health. We've actually run targeted preparedness sessions with the whole health sector. We've also focused on aged care and peak bodies that care for people with special needs for that exact purpose, to make sure that they are prepared, they're ready for it. I mean, the whole principle here is like a cascading system that, everybody's aware of it, and then they put their systems in place to be prepared.
Any further questions about these topics? Mike?
Right, Senator, just on the Senate this week, are you disappointed that an EPA, a deal to legislate an Environment Protection Agency is off the cards for this year?
Well, obviously we put legislation forward. We thought it was good legislation that ought to be passed. We continue to talk to people. But it is a busy legislative program, as you can see in the Senate today, and not everything that we seek to progress this year will be progressed.
If you thought it was good legislation, why did the government withdraw it, given that the Greens have said publicly that they were willing to support the legislation and a deal that came with it?
I'm not the Environment Minister and I'm not privy to all of the discussions, but I will say this, that we continue to work on all aspects of our environment agenda. We're delivering stronger protections for lands and waterways and plants and animals. We're making faster decisions for business at the same time. And of course, my colleague, Minister B.O.M, will stand up later today and speak a little about the progress that we are making on reducing our emissions.
You're not the Environment Minister, but you were the co-founder of Labor's Environmental Action Network. After news broke that this wouldn't be, the EPA bill wouldn't be pursued this year, Lee put out a very strong statement. I'll quote here: "Today is a hard day for true believers. Vested interests won. This was a chance to show strength and conviction. We know that these things the electorate are looking for from us, and we faltered." What is your response to that, and in particular to Labor members who fought for years for this?
I'll say this. Lean are an incredibly important part of the party organisation, and they play a really important role. And you're right that I was involved in Lean in its early days, although not now. I have a different role to play. As I said to you earlier, I'm not the Environment Minister, and I know that the government continues to work on its environment agenda. It involves many features, many aspects, and later today we'll see Minister B.O.M stand up and talk about the progress we are making.
What is your message to the true believers?
Later today we'll see Minister B.O.M stand up and talk about climate change. You have heard Minister Plibersek on many occasions talk about the progress we are making with marine parks, the progress we are making on threatened species, investments in threatened species protection, the work that we are doing internationally to support biodiversity conservation. Our government continues to work on matters that are important to the environment, important to future generations, both in Minister B.O.M's portfolio and Minister Plibersek's portfolio.
Minister, on another topic, it looks like on Tuesday a suspected boatload of Chinese nationals was intercepted by a border force in the north of the country. Do you have any information on whether that group of people were asylum seekers or illegal fisher people? And it seems to be a growing trend now of Chinese nationals getting intercepted by border force here in Australia. Do you have any understanding of why that trend may be growing?
I don't have it. You've asked me whether I have information on that. I'm not in a position to provide information to you about that.
Last question.
What did you make of Senator Lydia Thorpe's behaviour in the Senate press gallery this morning?
Let me say this about the Senate and our democratic institutions more generally. It is a willing environment. We have people who come here representing their communities, bringing different perspectives. What matters in a democracy is our ability to engage with one another courteously and to ensure that it is a place where we can listen to one another and arrive at good decisions in the national interest. Part of that means treating one another with respect. And the decision to suspend Senator Thorpe, which occurred yesterday and is in place for today, arose because of a concern across the Senate that Senator Thorpe's behaviour was not supportive of our institutional goals. As a Senate, we need to be able to work together. We need people to observe the directions and the requests that are made to them by the President, and we need people to feel comfortable to raise their views in our place of work, but also, and I think in some ways more importantly, our place of debate. Those things are important for all senators. They're important for me, and we consider that they're important for all of the senators who seek to participate in that debate in that chamber.
Was that a breach of the suspension, her entering the gallery, or does the suspension only cover the Senate floor itself?
I'll leave that to the presiding officers to make an assessment about that. I don't have any information about how we would assess that situation. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.